Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appsian. I would like to thank you for joining us on the webinar today. What we will be covering is kind of more of a product-specific solution inside of SSO and MFA today. Just so everybody knows, do a little meeting management. Everybody is muted because otherwise it would be very difficult to have the webinar today. If you do have any questions, you can always use the question section inside of the GoToWebinar control panel. Normally it's on the right hand side of your screen. If you submit a question there, I will do my best to make sure that I get it answered. Additionally, you can always email info@appsian.com to make sure that any question that's not covered today, we can definitely follow up with that way as well. So let's do a brief intro of what we're going to be covering today from an agenda perspective. I will intro Appsian and myself, and then I'll go into some of the discussions of why single sign-on and multi-factor authentication and what a lot of organizations are attempting to do with that, different ways to implement it, why you may choose one way over the other, and then obviously jump in and demo how all of this works as well. So when we talk about who is Appsian, we do make the PeopleSoft systems exceptional. One of the things that we do, we are a application company. So it's not about consulting hours or any of those type of situations. It really is about applications that help you modernize and secure your PeopleSoft applications. We've got two main product spaces. One of them is in the application security side, which you'll see a little bit of today, and the other one is on the user experience. We've got over 200 customers globally, so we are dealing with a lot of different issues from across the globe, whether that be from security, user experience, or whatever. It's just a lot of different issues from privacy, different regulations, all of those other type of things. We also are a member of the Oracle PeopleSoft Customer Advisory Board, and we're one of the few vendors that's a member of that group. My name, as I said earlier, is Greg Wendt. I am the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appsian. I've got over 20 years of PeopleSoft experience. I first started with upgrades from version 5 to version 7, so I've always been on the customer side, not always on the vendor or sales side. So I did work in your world for a long time, spent the last 11 years in higher ed as an enterprise architect, running both HR, financials, campus, and the portal system. So I upgraded all of those to 9.2 before leaving. So I've dealt with a lot of the situations that you guys deal with on a day-to-day basis. I've also got experience in retail and oil and gas. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about some of our customers, just real quick, we do cross a lot of the different perspectives of verticals, if you want to look at them that way. And the interesting part about that to me is, especially from a security perspective, a lot of the issues are the same. You know, when you're talking about implementing single sign-on or multi-factor authentication, it doesn't really matter what vertical you're in, whether it's higher ed, government, or financial, for example. You're going to want to implement those, and the interaction is going to be the same. You're dealing with your end users. How are you going to interact with them? What is the end goal? How do you want to enforce that? All of those other type of scenarios. So when you're dealing with a security, especially single sign-on and multi-factor, it really is consistent across regardless of what vertical you're in. So when we talk about implementing multi-factor or SSO, one of the things that I want to start with is MFA. A lot of organizations, and I was actually just having this conversation with somebody this morning, is the difference between a MFA at the front door. So when I sign into my PeopleSoft system or if I sign into my SSO system, I'm going to be fine and dandy if I just challenge for an MFA at that login event. A lot of times what we've seen is it sounds good in theory, but a lot of times from an end user engagement perspective, it doesn't come across very effective. The other issues are too, when you think about your PeopleSoft system as a whole, not all of your IDs or the people that are accessing your system or the accounts that access your system, really is probably how I should word that, are accessing via your identity provider. So it automatically normally creates a gap or a back door in which very high profile or high privileged accounts can then access your PeopleSoft system. Think about your PeopleSoft administrators. Frequently, they may use a shared style account to where they are going to access the system. You don't necessarily know who's accessing it and what they're doing in there because you don't have that visibility inside of the product, but they're accessing the system without using your identity provider. So it is the most high privileged account because they do all of your maintenance or patches. So they've got basically, God access inside of the application. And it's always the one, honestly, that I had to deal with from an audit perspective. I had to answer the audit questions on that one probably most frequently of, what is this person doing? And you basically have to sign off that you accept the risks that these people are being able to do what they're able to do. So when you're talking about implementing MFA effectively, that is one of the first areas that I really see probably a gaping hole when somebody's just going to do it at the front door. It doesn't solve all of your issues. It does leave a back door, and it's something that you need to, think about from that perspective. The other effects of, let's talk about single sign-on and multi-factor together, for example. So when we put those two together, that's frequently where you'll see, somebody just logging in and they'll challenge for MFA right at login. But the problem with that is when you think about what your customers or your end users are doing inside of the application, implementing MFA very frequently to a lot of organizations take into effect what it's going to do on the end user. And that's ultimately your biggest user base. So you're affecting what they're either doing for a job or how they're changing or updating data, for example. So depending upon how you implement it and the choices that you make, it becomes a challenge for those end users to be able to access the system. And you don't want the MFA to be able to stand in the way of that. So implementing it just at the front door can cause some of those issues. The other problem with it is when you're dealing with the scenario of challenging every time somebody logs in, you can have MFA fatigue where people are not necessarily paying attention to it anymore, and they're actually just being inundated with so many different MFAs because they either closed out of the system, they logged out, now they've got to do it again, and whether it was intentionally that they closed their browser, or maybe they just did it on accident, but then now they've got to go through that MFA again. So it really gets into the real crux of the matter is when and where do you want to implement the MFA, especially with single sign-on. So a lot of times what I've seen is just from an implementation flow is you probably want to treat your users very differently. So you have different classes of users. Let's say you have a self-service group or role of users. You have high privileged users. You have PeopleSoft admins. You may have batch users. You may have report setup people. You may have testers. You may have student workers. Across the board, there's different groups of users. And frequently what happens as an organization starts is they'll attempt to roll out MFA to different segments of the population like that. When they're all set up inside of the IDP, that's, it's an okay solution because they can be able to do that. But then when you get into the applications, you might find that from a self-service perspective, it doesn't make sense to maybe challenge for MFA when people aren't doing anything sensitive. If all they're doing is logging in to maybe check a class schedule or, review some self-service information inside of HR, something like that, submit sick time. If somebody's trying to submit sick time, do they really need to be able to go through an MFA to be able to do that? Probably not. So it becomes, very, from a user engagement perspective, it kind of stands in the way of them trying to do their job. So when you're talking about those self-service users, being able to have that stepped up auth target what's important and when they need to go through that authentication really tends to change the buy-in from the end users. They see it and understand it when they have to contextually go through an MFA targeting something that is sensitive. So for their perspective, maybe it's direct deposit, maybe it's a W-4, it's something like that has more information than just the average self-service style page. And when you tie a multi-factor to an event like that or a transaction, the end users understand the engagement and why they're having to go through that process, and they'll go through it and happily go through that. Frequently, we've had customers that have done targeted MFA like that have end users call their help desk requesting additional MFA, which, if you think about it from that perspective, now you've taken the end user engagement and really put it out there in a way that they enjoy because they're asking for more. A lot of times what happens is MFA or SSO is a mandate coming down from the security side, and it's not something that's taking into effect the end users at all. So it's really, it's cool to actually see the implementations go very, very well and have those end users ask for it. The other side of single sign-on with MFA is when you're only doing it at the front door, the common question that a lot of the security groups are coming up with now is, now all of a sudden you have these, high privileged business users that are in the application all day. Literally, you may have some sort of, maybe it's a finance clerk, HR clerk, some scenario like that where that's their job. That's where they live on a daily basis, is inside of HR finance, and they're accessing all of this information, all throughout the day. Well, the problem with that is they may only authenticate once in the morning and never have to go through an MFA again. And how many times do they get up from their desk? How many times do they go to the restroom? How many times do they go for a smoke break? They go have lunch, and so a lot of security groups are getting uncomfortable with the fact that it's only occurring at login when you have users that are in an application set for 6, 7, 8 hours a day or longer. So being able to implement that and call the MFA from inside of the app, very targeted, maybe based upon different scenarios like that, is becoming a real initiative on how people want to roll it out. It gives you that flexibility, once again, to implement it the way you want to, rather than at a one and only sole place. When we step back and think about, just MFA as a targeted solution for a security situation, a lot of times organizations, I hear this when I do security reviews all the time of, well, I've got my cyber insurance and I'll deal with, the effects of a breach after it happens. Well, the problem in that scenario is the person who's making that comment isn't going to be the one dealing with the breach post-breach. It's going to be somebody else. And then the other side is, from a cyber insurance policy perspective, you really have to make sure that you understand their policy. Because from a lot of the policies are written now with that you need to continue to do your due diligence in regards to security and protecting those applications. And nowadays, multi-factor is really just standing in as a due diligence. It's something that you should do inside of your applications. It's just expected. You think about all the different ways that people access their bank accounts, or, paying bills, or any sort of scenario like that. My wife was actually ordering some coffee online the other day and texted me in the middle of the process and said, well, they're actually implemented MFA for me to be able to order my coffee. Oh, yes, I imagine they have. So it's taken into effect of all the way going into there. So if I have to go through an MFA to order coffee, I probably should have to go through an MFA to be able to update, company records and employee records and all of those other types of, transactions that are far more detailed than ordering coffee. So let's talk a little bit about, our application security platform and how we're able to do this. So when we talk about our platform, it really is based upon three main enterprise security initiatives. One is intrusion prevention. This is where we do tie into that single sign-on provider. We allow you to integrate with any sort of SAML or ADFS-based authentication provider. Frequently, the most that we're dealing with right now are probably ADFS, Okta. There's a few others. Names just escape me at the moment, but those are probably our two common most SSO providers that we've been working with, just from an implementation perspective here lately. And then we also allow you to bring in that multi-factor authentication down to the business transaction. And by that, I mean from an implementation perspective, you can pick and choose where you want to apply that MFA. It could be at a menu access, component access, page level access, or even all the way down to a field level where we layer those protections into the data loss, to where you're masking data on a page and it's literally just a field that's masked, and somebody has to go through a multi-factor to be able to view that data set. So that gives you a lot of flexibility. The other part that we do here is some IP filtering and least privileged access. And by least privileged, it's just making sure that when you have a high privileged user log on from home or external to your network, that they only get their self-service access. So they don't have access to those high privilege pages like query or administer workforce or, things like that you don't want people to be able to access from home. The other side of IP filtering and really tying those two layers together with the intrusion prevention and the data loss prevention is being able to understand where somebody's at. So a lot of our conditions are based into the rules to apply the security events as you're looking for them. So a lot of times maybe you don't need to enforce an MFA upon certain situations, but you always want to enforce an MFA when somebody's coming in external to your organization. Well, we can do that, so it's contextual. Depends upon where they're accessing, what they're accessing, those type of scenarios. So it becomes very targeted and applicable to what that user is doing at that point in time. The data loss prevention side really allows you to go in and configure how you want your sensitive data to be accessed throughout the PeopleSoft system. The nice part about it is it's all rules-based. It's any field inside of PeopleSoft, so it doesn't matter if you've built custom, pages or fields or any of those type things. You can pick your own field and mask that data. And it really helps control how that data is presented. Now with all of the different initiatives like GDPR, the California Privacy Act, those type of regulations are really causing a shift in how people are accessing and monitoring and looking at sensitive data. So really plugs in very well to supporting a lot of those regulations. And then when we get into incident response, this is where we give you that 360-degree view inside of what your PeopleSoft systems are doing. So it helps with compliance and audit support, with those regulations of GDPR, Sarbanes-Oxley, any of those type of regulations. It also helps with detection and forensics of a breach. So if you do have a scenario where you think maybe you've had some users fall for a phishing attack, you can then see what was done very quickly to be able to close that loop. Brute force attacks, all of those type of things just kind of show up with a big glaring red light over them. So it really gives you those protections and understanding of what's happening inside of your PeopleSoft system. So what this allows you to do from the platform is really build out a layered security model that allows you to pick and choose how you want to apply security inside of your applications. So when we look at, all of your users, maybe you don't want to treat them all the same. Self-service can be treated very differently than high-privileged or PeopleSoft administrators. You can have different logging, different multi-factor, different data masking. Maybe some group goes through single sign-on where another one doesn't. You can have location-based, so when they're coming in from outside of your network, I want to do different security events. So all of those things can be applied to your users how you want to apply them. It's not a one-size-fits-all. You don't have to say, well, this is what we're going to do. No, you have the ability and the customizations to be able to apply the security in a way that makes sense for your organization, which is ultimately the most important thing, is because, it's your organization. You want to do this the way you want to, and you want to tie into your enterprise goals and initiatives to make those a reality inside of the application. And not everybody does those the exact same way. So it does plug and play very well into supporting those. When we talk about how we're able to do this, one of the things that we are a filter that sits inside the PeopleSoft web server. So because of this, it lends into the architecture and the way we're able to solve very unique problems very streamlined and efficiently. So when being inside the PeopleSoft web server, we have access to many of the things that a lot of, say an enterprise firewall doesn't have access to. They don't know what a component or a menu or a page is or a field inside of PeopleSoft, for example. They have no idea. Well, we do. And we can use those attributes to be able to find access of those transactions or fields or pages and apply security events to them. So very frequently, because it's a rules engine, we will have many different rules running against the system that are applying security based upon the context of what somebody's doing and how they're accessing the system. One of our security events happens to be a block. With that, we just block access. We stop the transaction from firing, and we will actually display to the end user a message as to why they're not able to do that specific transaction. This is one of those things that's almost used in place of MFA in some scenarios. So if we look at the rules, you might define a rule looking for a transaction set that's important for you. So let's look for external access of query administrator. So somebody's trying to access query administrator from outside of your network. So they're coming in from a remote location. That could be their home, coffee shop, wherever, and they're trying to access the query administration tool. So there's a rule that's built that's looking for external access query administration, and when it finds it, it's just going to block that transaction. So as that user makes that request, it's going to be applied to that rule and contextually going to be stopped. The end user is going to see a message that says you can't access the query administrator because you're coming in remotely. This can only be accessed from inside of our network, yada, yada, yada. So there's no call to the help desk. They know exactly why they're not able to do that. So depending upon, what transactions or how you want them to be able to be done, that's a way that you can implement a security protection. Say we want to change that whole rule, all we have to do is drop out the action of a block and substitute the action of a redirect or an MFA if we want to do that. Now we have completely changed the process of how that rule is going to fire. So when that user is coming in remotely, they try to access query administrator, rather than blocking them, what's going to happen is we're going to redirect over to a multi-factor challenge. If that user can pass that multi-factor challenge and prove who they are, then they can gain access to the query administrator and go on about what they were doing. That's a choice. You can pick and choose to apply it any way you want to. Remote access to query administrator is not always a good idea, whether there's 2FA involved there or not. So, it's just an example of a scenario of what somebody might be looking for as to how you can apply that to the users as they're accessing the system. All of our logs are very lightweight and very specific. So when you talk about what you can capture there, all of the scenarios that you look for and build into a rule, you can build into a log action as well. So we often have what we have as our incident response log. It's our full activity log, and it captures all of the information to do just that, full incident response. So everything through PIA will let you know what the users, where they went, and you can fingerprint exactly what pages they touched and everything they did. We also have very specific logging that you can invoke that maybe tracks high privileged users, what they're doing, what pages they're at, click to views, all sorts of scenarios. Probably one of the most frequently high targeted logs that I'll see is tracking PeopleSoft administrators to make sure that they're not doing something, that they're not supposed to be doing, and also to prove that from an audit perspective, you do know what they did inside of the application set. So obviously, since we exist inside the PeopleSoft web server, there's going to be a few different installations that need to take place as well. So we're going to start with a project that needs to get loaded inside of the database. What this does is it loads all the records, pages, and components that are required to build out the rules to apply to these users as they're accessing the system. Obviously, we're going to have a plugin on the web server, and there's also an installation that takes place on the application server, especially with implementing multi-factor, because it allows you to implement the multi-factor in multiple different ways. So you would have all of those installs. They're very small. When we talk about the installation process against the system, we do schedule 2 hours of a go-to-meeting session. The only reason it's 2 hours long is so that we know that you guys have enough time to ask any questions that you want. It doesn't nearly take that time, and once you understand the process, it normally goes very, very fast. So we just make sure there's enough time for Q&A and training of your resources when we're going through that first install for the very first time, so that your team understands what's happening. So all of that takes place, and because we're inside the architecture, we can then make choices as to how to apply those security events to those users. So let's go into a little bit more detail on the single sign-on flow specifically. So when we step back and look at it, because of that architecture being in the web server, we really know whether or not a PeopleSoft session is authenticated or not. And by authenticated, I mean has a PS token, that they have a PeopleSoft session that's connected and authenticated. So as that user is accessing the system, what's going to happen is they're going to make a request for a PeopleSoft transaction. We're going to know whether or not they're authenticated or not. If they are not authenticated, what's going to happen is we are going to pass that user on to the identity provider. The identity provider will then challenge that user from an authentication request, user ID and password. Once that is fulfilled and passes successfully, the identity provider is going to hand back an attribute or a claim value to us, to our application security platform. Frequently, it's the name ID as an attribute value, but once that hands back, it's going to let us know who the user is, that they did pass the authentication request, and what the end user ends up with is an authenticated session with their normal roles and permission lists as if they had signed in directly to PeopleSoft themselves. Very streamlined process, from the end users. They don't really even notice a whole lot different. It's just the fact that they will use, if they haven't authenticated, they'll have to put in their credentials. If they have already authenticated, then it will allow you that true pass-through single sign-on type experience to where that user doesn't have to go through authentication again. So let's jump into demo so we can see some of this in action. Let me get this out of the way real quick. So what I've got here is I'm going to sign into our ADFS system. So I'm going to go ahead and authenticate here. What you're going to see is I'll be able to pick my user ID. So I'm just going to sign in as a self-service style account into ADFS. And I had not signed out. So let me kill this real quick so we can actually go through the process again, since I still had that up. I want to make sure you guys see from beginning to end. So want to make sure that is not the case. So let's go ahead and click the sign in. So I'm going to go in as Vicky's in, and I'm going to have to put in the user ID and password. So I'm going to go ahead and put in her password. And what we're going to do in this scenario is, since we are going into the Microsoft 365 cloud, basically, we're going to go ahead and open up a SharePoint site. This SharePoint site really just allows me to build PeopleSoft content. No, not really content, but just deep embedded links into the PeopleSoft system to allow and show that pass-through authentication. So I'm just going to open up the personal details link. You're going to see that I can now access that page. I didn't have to put in my credentials again. I had already authenticated to ADFS, and this is what we're using from a SSO perspective into the application. So I can gain access. We know who I am. I'm Vicky's in. That's who I authenticated as. But now the rest of the rules, say, for example, field masking and those type things, come into effect because those are contextual and inside of the application. So I've got field masking of the social security number. That's what you're actually seeing there. Another thing that we'll find frequently, though, especially from a single sign-on perspective, is the use of workflow. Think about expenses, approvals, some sort of transaction where you are emailing out to your employees or to your users a deep embedded link into the PeopleSoft system, and you want them to be able to access the system without having to go through authentication again. Most likely, if they're in your email system, they've already authenticated, so why should they have to do it again? So what I'm going to do is I'll just click the link here inside of the email. You'll see that it pops up directly takes me into the PeopleSoft system without having to authenticate. And then once again, this is where other rules will take effect to protect that system. So I've got an MFA surrounding the direct deposit access. So I allowed access to the page, but if somebody wants to update the account number, they have to go through that very targeted MFA. So now you're getting into some of the abilities of what we're able to do with tying in the MFA into the application, so that you can pick and choose how you want to be able to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do an unlock here. I've got this system configured with Duo, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a push notification to my phone. You'll see that come through on the left-hand side, and then I can either approve or deny. So I'm going to go ahead and approve. You're going to see it brings me contextually right back to the application, right back to that transaction. Now I have access to the account number, and as a user, I'm able to update that information or do whatever I needed to do with it. But if I didn't need to have access to the account number, maybe I have multiple accounts and just wanted to see the percentage going into each check, for example, I could have been able to do that without having to go through that MFA. So that really allows me to pick and choose how I want to apply that MFA to that user contextually as they're accessing that application. So let's log out, and I want to do that so we can log back in as a new user, but also show you a different way that you can do the single sign-on request, because frequently, maybe not everybody has access to the setup the way I have it here. So what I'm going to do is start accessing some PeopleSoft content directly. By that, I'm just doing a deep embedded link into PeopleSoft rather than typing it all. I'm just going to hit enter. What you're going to see here is very much what I talked about from the PowerPoint perspective. I am being redirected or pushed over to the identity provider to put in my credentials. I'm going to access as a different ID this time. So I'm going to just go ahead and click sign in. Once again, I'm passed back. You can see I'm now in as Betty, a different user. It was a different user ID and password, or a different credential that I signed in as. But once again, the field masking takes effect, because now I'm inside and I'm going to have those contextual rules. The nice part about the field masking here is there's no modification to the record page or component to make that work. Same thing with the multi-factor field masking, as that's all applied but via a rule, not a customization to the page. So now, as I'm in as Betty, she's a high privileged user, so I have my entire menu structure as I normally would have had if I would have logged directly into the PeopleSoft system itself. So let's go ahead and try and do that. So when we talk about that, frequently going back to those scenarios is not everybody has every account configured within their identity provider, and how are you going to be able to access the PeopleSoft system? So one of the scenarios, I can sign in directly, again, right as Betty. I'm just using the PS1 account, and I'm using the PeopleSoft 2-tier credentials at this point. Now I'm into the application as Betty, just lands in at the Fluid Self-Service page, and I can move about the application and do whatever I want to do. So it really does allow you the flexibility from an implementation perspective of being able to control that any way you want to see fit. There could be other reasons as to why, if I were to sign out, as to why maybe I want to apply MFA to different users at different times. Let's say I'm going to sign in as the PS account. The PS account, or the VP inside of HCM, or the VP1 account inside of financials, those are the highest privileged accounts, so by default. So maybe if somebody's trying to sign in as those, I do want to invoke a multi-factor sign-on. So I can go through that process. I'm going to go ahead and approve this. And you're going to see that it drops me in, but it does inject that multi-factor contextually differently. From the self-service perspective, no, I didn't get challenged until I went in to a sensitive style transaction, even through self-service. The nice part is if I were to sign in as Vicky's in directly against this database, it's going to treat me the exact same way, regardless of how I authenticated. PS1 was a higher privileged user, but not a super user like PS. So I want to treat those differently. I want to apply the security at a different point in time from an MFA perspective. So I'm going to sign back in as PS, and let's talk just real briefly as to the setup and configuration of this, because this is really where the elegance of the solution comes together. So let's look at the configure firewall behavior. What I'm going to show you is this is our rules engine. Our rules engine applies the security events that are built within those rules to the users as they're accessing the application. So I'm going to look at that ADFS challenge. One of the things that we have here is several conditions. The conditions, when all met or they all have to be true, the actions down below are going to fire. So in this scenario, I'm looking for two different conditions. One, that the user is not logged in. They don't have a valid PS token. They don't have a valid PeopleSoft session. So that's what I'm looking for there. The second condition is that they're not coming from the PeopleSoft login request page. We know that because we are inside the PeopleSoft web server. So we understand when that user happens to be on that page and can treat them differently. So when those two conditions are true, I'm going to go ahead and invoke that interaction for the single sign-on. So when we look at our actions, you just select the SAML-based SAML or ADFS authentication, and then you select a profile. So it's all about configuration and not customization at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that cloud identity provider. I'm going to select ADFS-B, the one I've got configured. Once you see from a profile perspective, the first couple of fields really just define this profile inside of PeopleSoft so you can look it up. The SAML type version is probably one of the most important flags on this particular configuration because it tells you which protocol you're going to be using to connect to this identity provider. Are you going to use ADFS or are you going to use SAML? Which version of the protocol are you going to use, for example? The next is the URL section here in the middle. And what that does is it basically sets up the configuration of where to look for login and log out, and also what system is going to be configured inside of your identity provider. So if you look at this, this gets registered inside of the IDP. So because of that, there's about 5 or 6 lines of XML that have to get loaded inside of the identity provider. That would be done by your IDP admin. And once they load those in there, this system then becomes basically registered to be able to communicate with the identity provider. Once that happens, there's some mapping that needs to take place as to what is coming back from the identity provider to us. As I said earlier, frequently it's the name ID, doesn't have to be. Maybe it's an email address, maybe it's something else. It's something to identify who this user is in PeopleSoft. We can even go in and map, take a value coming from the identity provider and then go look it up and match that user inside of the system. In a production instance, I would definitely recommend a check signature, of which there would be a certificate code down here below. The nice part about this is once this profile is configured, the rules then invoke it. So they can get called. You can have multiple different identity providers within one PeopleSoft system. We have one organization with as many as 5 set up inside of one common system. That's a lot. But what it is we are looking for those conditions, and then we're going to, implement the one that makes sense, or the identity provider that user is connected to. So lots of flexibility, lots of options. That's the main thing, is you're dealing with configuration, not customization. So it allows you to move very, very quickly from an implementation perspective. So you don't spend your time trying to, support SSO. You get to spend your time implementing it very quickly and then leveraging it for your end users. So, that boils down really what needs to be done from an SSO perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the MFA from the rules. So I've talked about, how you can build MFA on a page or when a user signs in. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about building out a rule based upon some specific access of a page or a component inside of the application. What you're going to find here, and this is where the elegance of the solution to me really ties together, because it's very consistent to what you just saw from a single sign-on solution implementation. So from the conditional perspective, we're looking for a couple of different conditions. One, that the user's logged in, and 2, that they're accessing a specific area of the application. This is our online content group, is what we refer to this as. What this is it allows you to pick a area of the application. I say area because it's kind of defined by scope. You guys are all PeopleSoft people, so menus, components, or pages, those are all just different scopes inside of PeopleSoft. Do I want to start very broad, or do I want to be very, very narrow and specific as to where I want to apply this MFA on? So what I did was I set this one up to be based upon components. So it's going to return true for any page under each one of these components. So these are the components that I'm looking for. And like I said, it would return true for any page up underneath that. So if somebody accesses the query admin tool, they're going to match true. And what's going to happen is it's going to implement the multi-factor challenge. So this is the one that I've got configured with Duo. So you can see very similar from, the drop-down list of what you're implementing. This is the action type is a 2-factor challenge. Now I have a provider. So which MFA vendor am I dealing with? And then also which profile. So once again, very similar to what you saw from an SSO integration. Let's go out and look at the configuration of the Duo setup. So I'm going to open up the PeopleSoft 2. This is really the only page that you have to fill in with our Duo implementation. What it does is it registers the keys to be able to communicate with your Duo installation. That's it. Once you populate this particular page, you can then use that profile inside of the rules and choose how you want to define MFA, whether that's at a menu, page, component, field level. You pick, you choose how you want to do it, log on, all sorts of different options. So it gives you a lot of flexibility there. But this is one of the areas that gives you even greater flexibility. So from a self-service perspective, as they're accessing the application, a lot of those users are only going to be in the application for 10 or 15 minutes on average. Obviously they can be in longer, but on average they're going to go in, they're going to do something, and then they're going to get out. So when they're talking about passing an MFA, having a session-based MFA makes sense for a self-service user, because once they pass it, most likely they're not going to be in it long enough to continue redoing one of those events. So when we talk about high privileged users, maybe the whole default configuration of having it being session-based, maybe you want to be able to fine-tune that a little bit. So this is where we give you that flexibility. As I said earlier, it's all about configuration, not customization. So we go in and you can set up the token to expire based upon time. Maybe you want it at 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120 minutes. Maybe you want it down to hours. You can pick and choose what makes sense for you. The nice part about that is, what's going to occur is this is going to fire based upon that event. So if the user, say, going back to the rule, I've got this configured to fire on somebody accessing the query administrator tool inside of, one of these particular component structures. So if I go back to that, maybe they're not in query for an hour or 2 hours, then the next time they come in, that's when they'll have to pass it again. So it's when that event or when that transaction triggers the rule again. Another thing is, from a configuration perspective, we had some commercial customers that were very adamant about the number of uses. So every third time or every fourth time somebody did a process, they wanted to inject a multi-factor. That was just their requirements. Don't say I agree or disagree. That was their requirements. The nice part about it is it's all configuration, so they are able to do that via setup and control how that works. So if I were to navigate back out to one of these components, you can quickly see that it's just going to fire based upon somebody accessing that. So I'm going to go to the report. Oops, missed it. Going to go to the reporting tools. And I'm going to go to query. I'm going to go to query manager. And what you're going to see is I immediately get prompted with that Duo multi-factor. That is the rule that we just talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and approve that. And what you'll see contextually, we understand the difference. We know where you're headed. Self-service, we unlock that field, show you the field. High privileged, we bring you into the query manager where you were requesting in the first place. So when you're talking about being able to implement these, they do tie in a lot at times together. When you're talking about SSO and MFA, they can be treated very, very differently. But the nice part about it is, with what we allow you to do, it becomes configuration, not customization, and, big maintenance of the product, which really, lowers your support costs, moving forward and those type of things. So I'm going to move back over to the PowerPoint here real quickly. So, just wrapping up, when we do talk about it, our application security platform allows you to implement the multi-factor and SSO very specifically and easily inside of your environment. The nice part is we can apply that MFA the way you want to see fit throughout the application based upon those users or the roles, who they are, where they're accessing. That contextual-based MFA really changes how the end users are able to interact with those applications, and it gives you a lot of flexibility from a configuration and setup perspective of being able to apply your security models to your end users. So, hopefully today you learned that implementing single sign-on and MFA don't have to be this massive challenge. We can help you. We do partner with you. We want you to become very successful. We want you to be able to protect your organization as quickly as possible, which is many of the reasons why, from an implementation perspective, you're really looking at 30 to 45 days or less to be able to implement these protections inside of your environment. So I would like to say thank you for your attendance today. I hope you found it very beneficial, and I hope you learned something. I look forward to seeing you on another webinar in the future. And once again, if you do have any questions, please email info@appsian.com. We will definitely follow up with you. Appreciate your time and attendance, and have a great rest of the day.